The wind coming down off the bitter ridge did not just blow. It hunted. It tore through the seams of coats and found the gaps in the chinking of log walls, carrying with it the scent of pine resin and the metallic tang of impending snow. It was late in the autumn of the 1870s, and the mining town of Red Creek huddled in the shadow of the peaks like a wounded animal trying to stay out of the weather. Elias Ward felt the town before he saw it. The solitude of the high country had thinned his blood to the noise of men, and the clamor of Red Creek, the strike of hammers, the braying of mules, the shouts of teamsters, hit him like a physical headache behind his eyes. He rode a shaggy, sure-footed roan that seemed as reluctant to enter civilization as he was. They moved slowly down the main thoroughfare, the horses' hooves sucking at the half-frozen mud that served as a street. Elias was a man shaped by the geography he inhabited. He was broad at the shoulder, built with the heavy, enduring strength of old timber. His beard was thick, streaked with early gray that matched the iron color of his eyes. He wore buckskins that were greased and dark with use, and a heavy wool coat that had seen better years. To the townsfolk watching from beneath the overhangs of the mercantile and the assay office, he looked like a piece of the mountain that had broken off and rolled down into the valley. He ignored their stares. He was used to the looks. They were glances measured in equal parts wariness and mockery. To the miners and the cattlemen, a man who lived alone above the timberline was suspect. They called him a hermit, a savage, or a fool who had not yet realized he was dead. Elias knew they whispered that he had money buried up there, or that he was running from the law, or that he had lost his mind in the thin air. He let them talk. Their words meant less to him than the bark of a coyote. He pulled the roan up in front of the livery stable, dismounting with a stiff grace. His knees ached from weeks in the saddle, checking trap lines along the icy streams of the upper basin. He handed the reins to a stable boy who looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Grain him well," Elias said, his voice raspy from disuse, "and check the left hind shoe. It is working loose." He pressed a silver coin into the boy's palm, more than the service was worth, and turned toward the center of town. He needed flour, salt, coffee, and ammunition. But first, he needed to wash the taste of pine needles and solitude out of his throat. The sign above the door swung on rusted hinges, screeching in the wind. The Golden Nugget. It was a grandiose name for a building that was essentially a barn with a false front, smelling of sawdust, unwashed bodies, and stale beer. Elias pushed through the batwing doors. The heat inside was a solid wall, thick with tobacco smoke that hung in blue strata beneath the low ceiling. The noise was a roar, a piano clanking out a tune that had lost its rhythm, the clatter of chips, the roar of laughter. He moved to the far end of the bar, finding a space where the shadows were deepest. "Whiskey," he told the barkeep. "The bottle." He poured a glass and drank it neat, letting the burn settle in his stomach. He kept his hat low, his back to the wall, his eyes scanning the room out of habit. A man did not survive the high country by sleeping, and he did not survive a town like Red Creek by being careless. The energy in the room circled around a large round table near the pot-bellied stove. A crowd had gathered there, 3 deep, watching a poker game that had evidently been running since the sun was high. At the center of the attention sat Brett Kincaid. Everyone in the territory knew the Kincaid name. His father owned the Double Bar Ranch, a sprawling empire of grass and cattle that controlled half the valley. Brett was the heir apparent, a man who wore his father's power like a weapon. He was handsome in a soft, spoiled way, dressed in a black frock coat and a silk vest that caught the lamplight. His face was flushed with drink, his eyes bright and cruel. He was winning, and he was loud about it. "Read them and weep." "Boys!" Brett shouted, slamming a hand of cards down onto the felt. A groan went up from the other players. 2 grim-faced miners and a traveling salesman who looked like he was sweating away his commission. Brett raked in the pot with greedy, manicured hands, laughing a sound that lacked any real mirth. Elias watched him with a detached distaste. He had known men like Brett Kincaid before. They were the kind of men who shot wolves for sport and left them to rot, who rode horses until their hearts burst, Then Elias saw the woman. She was sitting on a high stool slightly behind Brett's left shoulder, tucked away like a piece of luggage he had forgotten to check. She wore a dress of pale blue silk that might have once been elegant, but was now frayed at the hem and stained with the gray dust of the town. Her hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that was striking not for its beauty, though she had that, but for its utter stillness. She was staring at the floorboards, her hands folded in her lap. Elias shifted his stance, narrowing his eyes. Even from across the room, he could see the yellow-green shadow of a bruise blooming along her jawline. Another dark mark ringed her wrist where the sleeve had pulled back. One of Brett's friends, a hanger-on named Miller who laughed at all of Brett's jokes, bumped into her chair as he leaned in to see the cards. He did not apologize. He shoved the chair aside with his boot to make room for himself. "Move back, darlin'," Miller sneered. "You are blocking the luck." The woman did not speak. She moved the stool back a few inches, her movements stiff and careful, as if she were made of glass that had already shattered and was only being held together by willpower. A murmur ran through the men standing near Elias at the bar. "That is the wife," one man muttered into his beer. "The Kincaid woman," another asked. "I heard she was barren. Barren and bad luck," the first man confirmed, spitting on the floor. 3 years married and no children. They say she is ruined in the head too. Worthless. Elias felt a cold prickle of irritation at the base of his neck. He took another drink, intending to finish it and leave. The business of the town was not his business. The cruelty of men was as common as snow in January, and usually just as impossible to stop. But he did not leave. The game continued, and the tide began to turn. The luck that Brett Kincaid felt was his birthright began to evaporate. He lost a large hand to one of the miners, then another to the salesman. The mood at the table shifted from raucous celebration to a tense, simmering anger. Brett signaled for more whiskey. He drank it as if he were trying to put out a fire in his belly. His play became reckless. He bet heavy on weak hands, trying to bully the other players with the weight of his money rather than the strength of his cards. It did not work. "Damn you." Brett slammed his fist on the table, making the chips jump. "You are cheating, you filth-covered badger. I am playing the cards." "Mr. Kincaid," the miner said calmly, though his hand drifted toward the knife at his belt. Brett's eyes darted around the room, looking for a target for his humiliation. His gaze landed on his wife. "You," he hissed, turning in his chair. "You are the hex. Stop looking at me like that." The woman, Cora. Elias remembered the whispers, did not look up. "I am doing nothing. Brett, you are breathing," he snapped. "That is enough to sour the air." The cruelty was casual, practiced. It was a performance for the room, a way for Brett to assert dominance even as he lost his gold. The game required a fifth player, the salesman. Having won back his dignity and a little profit, wisely decided to cash out. He stood up, tipping his hat. "I am out, gentlemen. My wagon leaves at first light." "Sit down," Brett roared. "I am not done with you." "I am done. However," the salesman said, backing away nervously. Brett looked around the room, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He needed fresh blood. He needed someone to beat. His gaze swept over the bar and locked onto Elias. "You!" Brett shouted, pointing a finger that trembled slightly. "The mountain man. You have been drinking my air for an hour. Come take a seat." Elias set his glass down. "I have no interest in your game." Brett laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "No interest? Or no coin? I hear you trappers trade in beaver pelts and pine cones. Do you have American dollars, or are you going to bet your stench?" The room went quiet. Insulting Elias Ward was not something most men did lightly. Elias stood to his full height. He brushed the sawdust from his sleeve. He should walk out. He should turn his back and ride up to the ridge where the air was clean. But then Cora looked up. For a single second, her eyes met his across the smoky distance. They were dark, terrified eyes, rimmed with the red of unshed tears. But beneath the terror, Elias saw something else. It was a spark, a plea, a fierce, silent defiance that screamed, "Do not leave me here with them. It was the look of a trapped animal that had not yet decided to die. Elias felt a churn in his gut, a sudden, sharp ache that had nothing to do with whiskey. It was an old wound, a memory of a different woman, a different time, and a failure he had carried for 20 years. He walked to the table. The crowd parted for him, the men stepping back as if he were a loaded cannon. "I have coin," Elias said softly. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He upended it, spilling a heavy stack of gold coins onto the green felt. They were old coins, Spanish gold and heavy American eagles, earned from years of furs and solitude. Brett's eyes widened, greed warring with his anger. "Well then, pull up a chair, mountain man. Let us see if you play as ugly as you smell." Elias sat. He did not look at Cora again, but he could feel her presence like a heat source at his elbow. The game resumed. The stakes climbed. Elias played with a stony impassivity. He did not talk, did not smile, did not celebrate when he won or curse when he lost. He simply played the mathematics of the cards, watching Brett unravel. An hour passed, then 2. The atmosphere in the saloon grew heavy and suffocating. The other players, sensing the personal war between the mountain man and the rancher's son, played conservatively, folding early, letting the 2 heavyweights batter each other. Brett was losing everything. He had lost his cash. He had written markers against his father's cattle, which the barkeep accepted with a skeptical grimace. He was drunk now, truly drunk, his movements sloppy, his speech slurred. "Deal the cards," Brett commanded, his voice thick. Elias sat motionless. "You are out of money, Kincaid, and your credit is dry." "I'm good for it," Brett screamed, standing up so abruptly. His chair clattered backward. "My name is Kincaid. I own this town. You own nothing on this table," Elias said calmly. Brett looked around frantically. He saw the pity and the contempt in the eyes of the crowd. He saw the barkeep shaking his head. He looked at his hands, empty of chips. Then he looked at Cora. She was sitting perfectly still, her face pale as parchment. "I have a stake," Brett said, a wicked grin spreading across his face. It was a smile that made Elias's skin crawl. "You have nothing," the miner said. "Go home, Brett. I have her." Brett pointed a shaking finger at Cora. The room went deadly silent. Even the piano player stopped, his hands hovering over the keys. Cora did not flinch, but Elias saw her hands clamped together in her lap until the knuckles were white. "You are betting your wife?" Elias asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Why not?" Brett laughed, but his eyes were dead. "She is property, isn't she? And not very good property at that. She is barren as a salt flat. She is sour-tempered. She is worthless to me." He looked at Elias, his chin jutting out in a challenge. $500. Brett said, "I value her at 500. Put up your gold against her. One hand, winner takes all." A murmur of shock and titillation ran through the crowd. This was something new. This was a story they would tell for years. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Cora looked at her husband. Her voice was a whisper, but in the silence, it carried to every corner of the room. "Brett, please, do not do this. Shut up," Brett snapped. "You have been a millstone around my neck for 3 years. Let us see if you can finally earn your keep." He turned back to Elias. "Well, are you a coward? Or do you want her? Everyone says she is trash, but maybe a mountain man likes trash." Elias looked at the gold on the table. It was everything he had saved for the winter supplies, for new traps, for the life he maintained. Then he looked at Cora. He saw the bruise on her cheek. He saw the way she held her breath, waiting for the blow to fall. If he walked away now, Brett would drag her home, and behind closed doors, Brett would make her pay for the humiliation of this night. She would not survive the winter. Elias knew that with a certainty that chilled his bones. "Deal the cards," Elias said. The barkeep, who had taken over the dealing to ensure fairness, wiped his forehead with a rag. His hands shook as he shuffled. The snap of the pasteboards was the only sound in the room. Brett sat back down, grinning like a skull. He believed he could not lose. He believed the universe owed him this salvation. The cards were dealt, 5 cards each. Draw poker. Brett snatched his up. He looked at them and let out a bark of triumphant laughter. He discarded 1 card and slammed his hand on the table. 1 card, he demanded. The barkeep slid it across. Elias picked up his hand. He held the cards close to his chest. He had a pair of 8s and a pair of queens. It was a decent hand, but not a great one. He looked at Brett's face. The man was practically vibrating with confidence. He had a flush, or a full house. Elias could see it in the dilation of his pupils. Elias discarded 2 cards. 2, he said. The barkeep slid them over. Elias did not look at them immediately. He let them sit on the felt. He watched Cora. She was not breathing. Her eyes were fixed on the back of his cards as if she could burn through them with her will. "Show them!" Brett yelled. Elias turned over his draw cards. A queen and an 8. A full house, queens over 8s. He laid them down on the table, spreading them slowly. "Queens full," Elias said. Brett stared at the cards. He blinked, trying to make the image change. He looked at his own hand. He shook his head, a spasm of denial crossing his face. "No," he whispered. He threw his cards down. They scattered across the wood. 2 jacks, 2 10s, and a useless 4. 2 pair. He had lost. The silence in the room stretched out, thin and tight as a wire. Everyone stared at the table, at the gold, at the woman. Elias Ward had just won another man's wife. Brett sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing. Then he let out a laugh, a high, broken sound. "Well, that is a joke," he said, looking around the room for support. "That is a fine joke. Good game, mountain man. I will take my chips back now." He reached for the pot. Elias caught his wrist. His grip was like an iron trap. "The hand is played," Elias said. "The wager stands." Brett tried to yank his hand back, but he could not move it. "Don't be a fool. You can't own a woman. It is against the law. It was a joke, a tavern bet." "I heard no joke," the barkeep said heavily from behind the table. He looked at Brett with open disgust. "You better. Kincaid, we all heard it, and you lost." Brett's face went purple. "I am not giving her to him. He is a savage. He lives in a shack. You should have thought of that before you put her in the pot," Elias said. He released Brett's wrist and stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. Elias looked at the room. He saw the leering grins of the miners, the shock of the merchants. He felt a wave of nausea. He did not want this. He did not want a wife, and he certainly did not want to participate in this slave trade charade. But he looked at Cora. She had not moved. Her face had gone from white to a strange, eerie calm. She was looking at him, waiting. "I do not want to own you," Elias said, his voice cutting through the noise. Brett let out a sigh of relief. "See, he has sense." "But," Elias continued, ignoring Brett, "I will not leave you with him." He turned his gaze on the barkeep. "Get a paper and a pen." "What?" Brett demanded. "Write it down," Elias commanded. "Write that Brett Kincaid relinquishes all claim, legal and marital, to Cora Kincaid. Write that he lost her fairly in a game of chance and that he forfeits any right to pursue her or demand her return." "I will not sign that," Brett spat. Elias leaned across the table. His voice dropped to a low rumble that sounded like rocks grinding together. "You will sign it, or I will take this payment out of your hide, right here, right now. And I will not stop until you are as broken as you have tried to make her." Brett looked at Elias's eyes. He saw no bluff there. He saw only a promise of violence that terrified him. He looked at his friends, but Miller and the others had backed away, unwilling to step between a mountain man and his prize. "Paper," the barkeep said, slapping a sheet of ledger paper on the table. He dipped a pen in ink and scribbled furiously. He turned the paper toward Brett. "Sign it." Brett took the pen. His hand shook so badly he dripped ink on the green felt. He scrawled his name, a jagged, angry signature. Elias took the paper. He blew on the ink to dry it. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. He turned to Cora. She stood up. She smoothed the front of her faded dress. She did not look at her husband. She did not look at the crowd. She looked only at Elias. "This paper means he cannot come after you," Elias said to her. "But it does not make you mine. I am riding out. Back to the ridge. You can come, or you can take this paper and go wherever you please." Cora looked at the door. Outside, the wind was howling, driving the temperature down below freezing. She had no money. She had no coat. She had no family who would take her in. If she stayed in Red Creek, she would be a pariah, the woman who was gambled away. But if she went with him... She looked at Elias. He was a stranger. He was rough and scarred and terrifying in his own way. But he had stood up. He had not laughed. "I will go," she said. Her voice trembled, but the words were clear. The room erupted. "Look at that," Miller shouted. "She prefers the bear to the bed. Mountain man won himself some trash," someone else yelled. "Better check her for fleas." "Ward." The laughter was crude, filthy, and loud. It washed over them like sewage. Brett was laughing loudest of all, trying to salvage his pride by pretending it was a relief to be rid of her. "Take her," Brett yelled. "She is nothing but trouble anyway." Elias did not respond. He unbuttoned his heavy wool coat and took it off. He draped it over Cora's shoulders. It engulfed her, swallowing her small frame, the hem hitting her shins. It smelled of wood smoke and pine and horse, a heavy, masculine scent that was suddenly the only shield she had against the world. "Let's go," Elias said. He put a hand on her back, not grabbing her, just guiding her. A light touch. They walked toward the door. The crowd parted, but the jeers followed them. Elias kept his eyes forward, his jaw set like granite. Cora kept her head high, her eyes fixed on the bat-wing doors as if they were the gates to heaven. They stepped out into the night. The cold hit them instantly, a sharp slap that took the breath away. The street was empty, the mud frozen into hard ruts. The wind howled down from the peaks, screaming through the eaves of the buildings. Cora shivered violently, pulling the giant coat tighter around herself. She looked up at the mountains, dark shapes against the star-strewn sky. They looked unforgiving, deadly. Elias untied the roan. He mounted, the saddle leather creaking in the cold. He reached a hand down. Cora hesitated for only a heartbeat. She took his hand. It was rough, calloused, and warm. He swung her up behind him with an easy strength. "Hold on to the saddle. Not me," he said gruffly. She gripped the cantle of the saddle, her knuckles brushing against his coat. She could feel the heat of him, the solid wall of his back. They rode out of Red Creek without looking back. Behind them, the lights of the saloon spilled yellow onto the snow, and the sound of drunken laughter faded into the wind. Ahead lay the bitter ridge, the darkness, and a terrifying, freezing freedom. Cora closed her eyes and inhaled the sharp, thin air. For the first time in 3 years, she did not know what would happen to her tomorrow. And for the first time in 3 years, she was not afraid of the man beside her. She was afraid of the cold. She was afraid of the wolves. But as the horse plodded upward into the dark, she realized she was no longer afraid of being worthless. The wind howled like a warning, but they rode straight into it. By the time the sun finally crested the eastern peaks, Red Creek was nothing more than a smudge of wood smoke miles behind them. The dawn did not bring warmth. It only brought a hard, revealing light that made the frost on the sagebrush glitter like crushed diamonds. The sky was a pale, bruised purple, clearing slowly to a cold steel blue. Elias Ward pulled the roan to a halt on a ridge that overlooked the valley floor. The horse blew hard, its breath pluming in the frigid air. Beside them, the pack mule Elias had retrieved from his cache outside of town stood with its head low, stoic and unimpressed by the long night's ride. Elias turned in the saddle to look at the woman. Cora sat perched atop the mule, her legs arranged awkwardly on the packs. She was shivering so violently that her teeth chattered with a sound like dry bones clicking together. The adrenaline of the saloon had faded, leaving behind only the brutal reality of the high country winter. The silk dress she wore was a mockery here, a flimsy thing meant for parlors and warm hearths, not for a wind that could freeze sweat on a man's skin in minutes. "Get down," Elias said, his voice rough from the silence of the night. Cora looked at him, her eyes wide and rimmed with exhaustion. She slid from the mule's back, her knees buckling as her feet hit the frozen ground. She grabbed the stirrup leather to keep from falling. Elias dismounted and dug into one of the canvas panniers on the mule's flank. He pulled out a coat, an old, heavy thing made of buffalo hide. The fur turned inward, the leather cracked and scarred from years of use. It smelled of wood smoke, wet dog, and tobacco, a scent so thick it was almost a presence. "Put this on," he said, holding it out. Cora stared at the coat, then at him. She reached out with a hand that was blue with cold. Her fingers were stiff, clumsy as she took the heavy garment. She pulled it on over the oversized wool coat he had given her the night before. The buffalo hide engulfed her completely. She looked like a child playing dress-up in a giant's clothes, the sleeves hanging inches past her fingertips, the hem dragging in the snow-dusted dirt. But the warmth was instant. She closed her eyes for a second, burying her face in the collar. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias did not answer. He was busy checking the cinch on the roan, his back to her. He tightened the latigo strap with a sharp jerk. "We have a long way to go," he said, keeping his eyes on the horizon. "And the trail gets worse from here. Drink some water. We do not stop again until high noon." They moved on. The trail leading toward Bitter Ridge was not truly a road. It was a scar in the earth, steep and littered with loose shale that clattered under the hooves of the animals. As they climbed, the air grew thinner, sharper. The trees changed from scrub oak and cedar to towering ponderosa pines and Douglas firs, their branches heavy with the threat of snow. Cora rode the mule now. Seated on a makeshift nest of blankets, Elias had rigged between the packs. The motion was jarring. Every step the animal took sent a jolt through her spine. Her inner thighs, unused to riding of any kind, let alone the wide, shifting load of a pack animal, began to ache with a burning intensity. Her hands, gripping the rough rope of the lashings, blistered within the first 2 hours. She did not say a word. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. She focused on the rhythm of the mule's ears twitching back and forth. She told herself that pain was better than the alternative. Pain meant she was away from Red Creek. Pain meant she was not in the parlor of the Kincaid Ranch, waiting for the heavy tread of boots in the hallway. But the silence between them was heavy. It was not the companionable silence of two people comfortable in the quiet. It was a tense, thick atmosphere loaded with unasked questions. Cora kept glancing back. She turned her head every few minutes, scanning the trail below them. She expected to see black shapes moving against the snow, Brett's riders, the flash of a rifle barrel, the dust of pursuit. Her fear was a physical thing, a tight knot in her chest that made it hard to draw a full breath. Elias, riding ahead on the roan, did not look back, but he saw her. He saw the way her head snapped around at the sound of a falling rock. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she made herself small inside the buffalo coat. Without a word, he reined the roan off the established trail. He turned the horse's nose toward a wall of scrub brush that looked impassable. "Where are we going?" Cora asked, her voice sharp with panic. "The trail is that way. That is the trail people use." Elias said, "We are not people today. We are ghosts." He led them onto a faint game trail, a path worn into the earth by generations of elk and deer. It was narrower, steeper, and infinitely more dangerous. It wound along the edges of ravines where a single misstep would mean a fall of 300 feet onto jagged scree. Cora gripped the ropes until her knuckles turned white. She understood what he was doing. He was hiding their tracks. He was taking them into the terrain that only a mountain man could navigate, a place where city-bred horses and hired guns would hesitate to follow. He knows every ravine, she thought, watching Elias navigate a narrow ledge with casual competence. He knows this land like he knows the back of his hand. The thought gave her a strange, reluctant comfort. They rode until the sun began to dip behind the western peaks, casting the mountain into a gloom of gray and indigo. The temperature plummeted. Elias finally halted in a stand of twisted bristlecone pines, their roots clinging to the rock like gnarled fingers. It was a rough camp, offering little shelter from the wind. But it was defensible. Elias worked efficiently. He stripped the gear from the animals, hobbled them, and gathered deadfall for a fire. He built it small and hot, hidden in a depression of rocks so the light would not carry. Cora stood by the fire, unsure of what to do. Her legs were so stiff she could barely walk. When she tried to step toward the warmth, her knees buckled, and she had to catch herself on a boulder. "Sit," Elias said. He tossed a bedroll onto the ground near the fire. She sat, sinking down with a groan she could not suppress. Elias opened a tin of beans and set it near the coals. He sliced salt pork into a skillet. The smell of frying fat and beans was the most wonderful thing Cora had ever smelled. As the darkness deepened, the sounds of the mountain woke up. The wind hissed through the needles of the pines. A branch snapped somewhere in the dark. And then the wolves began. It started as a single, low, mournful note, rising quickly into a chorus of yips and howls. They sounded close, too close. They sounded hungry. Cora gasped, jerking upright. Her hand flew to her throat. "They are hunting," Elias said calmly, stirring the beans. "Not us. Elk. Likely. They sound thin," Cora whispered. "Winter makes everyone thin," Elias said. He handed her a tin plate of beans and pork. She took it, her hands shaking slightly. She ate ravenously, shoveling the food into her mouth, forgetting her manners, forgetting everything but the hollow ache in her stomach. When the plate was clean, she set it down and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. She looked at Elias across the fire. He was watching the dark, his rifle resting easily across his knees. The firelight carved deep shadows into his face, making him look ancient and hard. "Thank you," she said again. Elias looked at her. "For the beans?" "No," she said. She looked down at her hands, focused on a blister that had broken on her thumb. For taking me, for not sending me back when the room laughed." She swallowed hard. The shame of it burned her face, hotter than the fire. To be wagered, to be won, to be treated like a stack of chips or a saddle. "I know what they said," she murmured. "I know I am. Worthless. That you got a bad deal." Elias set his plate down. He picked up a stick and poked at the fire, sending a shower of sparks drifting up toward the stars. "You are not a horse," he said, his voice flat. "And I am not a horse trader." He looked her in the eye. "That paper in my pocket," he said, "it does not make me your owner. It makes you free of him. That is all. I do not hold title to people." Cora looked at him, searching his face for the lie. She had learned early that men often use soft words to hide hard intentions. "Then why am I here?" she asked. "Why did you bring me?" "Because if I left you in Red Creek, you would be dead or back in his bed by sundown," Elias said bluntly. "And because the law in these parts is bought and paid for by the Kincaid brand. If a deputy finds you walking alone on the road, he will not ask if you want to go home. He will drag you there in irons for stealing yourself." Cora flinched. The word law made her shoulders tighten instinctively. "The law," she said, a bitter edge creeping into her voice. "The law is just men with badges who drink Brett's whiskey. The law has never looked at me and seen a person. It only sees a wife who does not know her place." Elias heard the venom in her tone. It was the sound of a trapped animal realizing the cage was made of rules as well as bars. "We are outside the law here," Elias said. "Up here, the only law is gravity and the cold. And they are honest, at least they kill you because that is their nature, not because they enjoy it." He tossed the stick into the fire. "You stay with me until we get to the cabin. You winter there when the pass clears in the spring. If you want to go to California or Oregon, I will give you a horse and a rifle. But until then, you stay close." Cora nodded slowly. It was not an offer of comfort. Exactly. It was a strategic alliance. But for the first time in her life, the terms were laid out clearly, without fine print. The next 3 days were a blur of exhaustion and awe. The country grew harsher as they climbed. The air became so thin that Cora felt lightheaded if she moved too fast, her lungs burning with every inhalation. The trees thinned out, becoming stunted and gnarled, fighting for purchase in the rock. On the afternoon of the fourth day, the sky turned a slate gray that erased the peaks. The wind died, leaving an eerie, suffocating silence. "Snow," Elias said, looking up. It came fast, not the gentle drifting flakes of a Christmas card, but a driving, stinging white sheet that reduced visibility to a few yards. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. "We have to stop," Elias shouted over the wind. He led them toward a rocky overhang he knew, a shallow cave formed by a slab of granite that had fallen centuries ago. It was barely enough room for them and the animals, but it was out of the wind. Elias worked with a frantic speed, unloading the mule and dragging the packs to the back of the overhang. He picketed the horses as deep in the shelter as he could, draping blankets over them. Cora did not wait for instructions. She saw the need. She scrambled out into the edge of the storm, gathering deadwood from the scrub pines. She dragged branches back to the cave, her hands numb, her face stinging from the ice pellets. Elias watched her as he secured the canvas tarp across the opening of the overhang to block the worst of the drift. He had expected her to sit and weep. He had expected to have to care for her like an invalid. But she was building a windbreak for the fire, stacking stones with a grim determination. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of work, not leisure. "You are handy," Elias said, shaking the snow from his beard as he came back to the fire she had started. Cora blew on her hands to warm them. "I grew up on a dirt farm in Nebraska," she said, her voice muffled by the collar of the buffalo coat. "Before my father died and my aunt sent me to town to be civilized, I know how to mend a fence. I know how to bleed a horse. I know more about chores than I know about fancy dresses." She looked down at the ruined silk of her skirt. "This dress was a costume," she said softly. "It never fit right anyway." Elias grunted. He opened his saddlebag and pulled out a strip of dried venison. He handed it to her. "Better to know how to mend a fence than how to dance a waltz up here," he said. They ate in silence while the storm raged outside. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the canvas tarp. "Why do you live up here?" Cora asked suddenly. "Alone." Elias chewed slowly. He looked into the fire. "I like the quiet," he said. "That is not an answer." Cora said, "No one likes the quiet this much unless they are running from the noise." Elias looked at her. She was sharper than she looked. "I was part of a cattle war down in Wyoming 20 years ago," he said. "Range disputes, barbed wire and hired guns. I saw men burn down a homestead with a family inside just to clear a water right. I saw what men can do when they decide someone is worth less than a horse." He paused, his eyes dark with memory. "I decided I did not want to be around men who did the math that way. And I did not want to be the man doing the math. So I came up here. The wolves, they kill to eat. That I can understand." Cora looked at him. She saw the scars on his knuckles, the way he held himself. He was a violent man who had chosen peace. And that was a very different thing from a peaceful man. They slept near the fire, wrapped in every blanket they had. The cold seeped into the stone beneath them, a constant, aching presence. In the deepest part of the night, the nightmare found Cora. She was back in the ranch house. The door was locked. The heavy footsteps were coming down the hall. She could hear Brett breathing, the smell of whiskey and stale cigars. He was heavy, pinning her down, his hands on her throat, squeezing, laughing. "No!" she screamed. "No, please!" She thrashed, fighting the weight, clawing at the hands. Elias woke instantly. He did not wake like a normal man, groggy and confused. He woke like a predator, moving from sleep to action in a heartbeat. He heard the scream, saw the thrashing shape beside him. Instinct took over. He reached out and clamped his hand around her wrist to stop her from rolling into the fire. "Cora!" he shouted. At his touch, Cora's eyes flew open. She did not see Elias. She saw the shadow of her husband. She saw the man who owned her. She screamed again, a raw, terrifying sound, and scrambled backward, kicking at him. "Get off me!" Elias realized his mistake. He let go of her wrist as if it were a hot coal. He held his hands up, palms open, backing away until his shoulders hit the rock wall. "It is me," he said, his voice low and steady. "It is Elias. You are safe. You are on the mountain." Cora scrambled into the corner of the overhang, pulling her knees to her chest. She was hyperventilating, her eyes darting around the small space. Slowly, the reality of the stone walls, the dying fire, and the bearded man with his hands up filtered through the panic. She looked at Elias. She saw the shock in his eyes. She saw the way he was making himself small, trying not to be a threat. She curled in on herself, burying her face in her knees. A deep, racking shudder went through her. "I am sorry," she sobbed. "I am sorry." "Don't," Elias said roughly. He felt a profound sense of helplessness. He could fight a bear. He could survive a blizzard. But he did not know how to fight the ghosts in a woman's head. He reached for the coffee pot, his movements exaggerated and slow. "I will make coffee," he said. "Go back to sleep if you can. I will watch the fire." Cora did not sleep. She lay there, trembling, listening to the wind and the steady, rhythmic sound of Elias breathing, wishing she could scrub the memory of Brett's hands from her skin. The next morning, the storm had broken. The world was buried in 2 feet of fresh powder, blindingly white under a brilliant blue sky. They dug themselves out and saddled the animals. Cora avoided Elias's eyes. She felt exposed, ashamed of her fear, ashamed that he had seen her broken. But as they rode, she began to notice things she had missed before. She noticed that when they stopped to rest the horses. Elias always positioned himself between her and the back trail. He did not stand over her. He stood guard for her. She noticed that he checked the skyline constantly, his eyes moving with a tireless vigilance. He was not keeping her in. He was keeping the world out. The realization settled in her chest, warm and strange. 2 days later, they crested a final ridge and looked down into a hidden meadow. It was a bowl of white, sheltered by towering cliffs on 3 sides. In the center, near a creek that ran black and clear through the snow, stood a cabin. It was not a shack. It was a structure built to last, made of heavy logs notched with precision. A curl of smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting he had banked the fire well before leaving weeks ago. There was a small corral, a sturdy shed, and a sense of permanence that defied the wildness of the landscape. "Home," Elias said. They rode down. The air here was still, protected from the biting wind. Elias helped her down from the mule. Her legs were so stiff she nearly fell, but this time, when he caught her arm to steady her, she did not flinch. He opened the heavy wooden door. The cabin smelled of pine pitch and old ashes. It was one large room with a stone fireplace, a table, and a bed in the corner. There was a smaller room off to the back, separated by a heavy curtain. "It is not much," Elias said, looking around as if seeing it through her eyes. "But the roof is tight." He gestured to the curtained room. "You can take the back room," he said. "It is warmer in the main room by the fire, but you will want your privacy." He began unbuckling his gun belt, hanging it on a peg by the door. "We share the work," he said, turning to look at her. "You cook, I hunt. We both chop wood. If we do not work, we freeze. Simple as that." Cora stood in the center of the room. She looked at the rough-hewn logs. She looked at the man standing there, awkward and imposing in his own home. The town would call this a scandal. Brett would call it adultery. The world would say she was a fallen woman living in sin with a savage. But as she looked at the thick walls, she realized she did not care what the world said. For the first time in years, there was a door that she could bar from the inside. "I can chop wood," she said quietly. Elias nodded. "Good." That night, the wind picked up again, clawing at the corners of the cabin. But inside, the fire roared in the hearth, casting a golden light on the logs. Cora lay on the narrow cot in the back room. The curtain was drawn, but she could see the flicker of the firelight beneath it. She could hear Elias moving in the main room, the creak of the leather chair, the soft thud of his boots dropping to the floor. She pulled the heavy quilt up to her chin. She listened to the silence. It was not empty. It was filled with the sound of his slow, steady breathing on the other side of the wall. She felt a knot of dread in her stomach, the fear of the winter, of Brett, of the future. But beneath it, there was relief. And beneath that, something else, a strange, terrifying flicker of yearning. Not for a savior, but for the man who had sat by the fire and told her she was not a horse. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 1,000 nights, she did not dream of running. She dreamed of snow, and silence, and the smell of pine smoke. Winter tightened its grip on the bitter ridge like a fist closing around a stone. The snow did not stop. It merely paused to catch its breath before descending again in heavy, suffocating sheets that turned the world into a monochromatic landscape of white and gray. The cabin, buried to the window ledges, became a ship at sea, isolated in an ocean of ice. Life inside the cabin shrank to a primal rhythm. There was no Sunday, no Tuesday, no hours marked by a clock face. There was only the wood pile, the water bucket, the fire, and the darkness. Elias Ward moved through this winter world with the efficiency of a man who had long ago made a truce with the cold. He was up before the dawn, breaking the ice on the creek to haul water, the metal buckets groaning in his gloved hands. He checked his trap lines on snowshoes, moving like a ghost through the timber, returning with beaver or snowshoe hair that he skinned with surgical precision by the light of the hearth. But this winter was different. He was not alone. Cora was no longer the trembling creature in the silk dress who had ridden out of Red Creek. The mountains demanded payment for survival, and she paid it in sweat and calluses. At first, Elias had done everything, treating her like a guest or an invalid. But Cora would not sit idle. The shame of being kept burned in her hotter than the fire. She began to take over the small tasks, then the larger ones. She learned that kindling had to be split thin as a finger to catch the spark. She learned that green wood hissed and smoked, so she dug deep into the stack for the seasoned pine. She learned to cook with almost nothing, making a stew from dried venison and precious flour that tasted like a feast because she seasoned it with wild sage she found dried in Elias's pantry. Elias watched her. He saw things she thought were hidden. He saw the way she counted the coffee beans before grinding them, hoarding them as if she feared they would vanish. He saw how she folded the spare blankets with military precision, stacking them in the exact same spot every morning, creating order in a world she clearly felt was chaotic. She was building a fortress of small habits, a way to tell herself that she had control over something, even if it was just the alignment of a spoon on the table. One evening, Elias came in from the shed, stamping the snow from his boots. The wind was rising again, whistling through the chinking of the logs. He found Cora sitting by the fire, his spare work shirt in her lap. It was torn at the shoulder, a rag he had meant to throw away. She was mending it. Her needle flashed in the firelight, weaving a thread she had unraveled from the hem of her ruined silk dress. The blue thread stood out against the gray wool of his shirt. A strange, delicate scar. "You do not have to do that," Elias said, hanging his coat on the peg. "That shirt is done for. It has miles left in it," Cora said without looking up. "The fabric is strong. It just needed holding together." She bit the thread and smoothed the fabric across her knee. Elias poured himself a cup of coffee and sat opposite her. He watched her hands. They were rougher now, the nails short and broken, the skin red from the cold water of the creek, but they were steady. He noticed something else, too. She was humming. It was a low, tuneless sound, barely audible over the crackle of the logs. It was the sound of a woman who was not afraid that the next noise she heard would be a shout or a blow. She had taken to braiding her hair in a single thick plait that hung over her shoulder, practical and severe, but it highlighted the line of her neck, and she had taken his old buffalo coat, the one that had swallowed her whole, and moved the buttons, cinching it so it fit her frame. She looked less like a lost child and more like a part of the cabin itself. "Thank you," Elias said, nodding at the shirt. Cora looked up, surprised. She smiled, a fleeting, shy expression that transformed her face. "It earns my keep," she said. "You earn your keep," Elias said gruffly. The stew was good. The compliment hung in the air, awkward and heavy. They were two people who had forgotten the language of kindness, learning it again one syllable at a time. A week later, the rhythm of their evenings changed. Elias was sorting through a wooden box he kept under his bunk. It was filled with the debris of his life: old trapping licenses, receipts for furs, sketches of trails, and maps he had drawn himself with charcoal and ink. He spread a large, creased map onto the table, smoothing it flat with his broad hands. He was studying a drainage to the north, planning where to set lines once the thaw began. Cora was sweeping the floor, the rhythmic swish-swish of the broom providing a backdrop to the silence. She paused near the table to trim the wick of the oil lamp. Her eyes fell on the map. She froze. The broom stopped moving. The silence in the room suddenly changed texture, becoming sharp and brittle. Elias, sensing the change, looked up. He saw Cora staring at the map, her face drained of blood. She looked as if she had seen a ghost rising from the parchment. "What is it?" Elias asked. Cora reached out, her finger trembling as it hovered over a specific section of the map, a high, teardrop-shaped valley tucked behind the razor edge of Bitter Ridge. It was a place accessible only by a hidden pass, marked on Elias's map with heavy charcoal shading. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. Elias frowned. "I drew it. That is the high meadow. It sits above the timberline, but it catches the southern sun. Good water, thick timber." "Why?" Cora asked, her voice tight. "Why did you draw it?" Elias leaned back in his chair. "I have been watching that valley for 5 years. The snow stays late, but the soil is black and deep. I have been thinking, when I am done with trapping, when my knees cannot take the cold water anymore, I might file a claim on it, build something permanent." He looked at her, confused by her reaction. She looked terrified. "Why does it matter to you?" he asked. Cora did not answer. She dropped the broom. It clattered loudly on the floorboards. She turned and walked to the back room, disappearing behind the curtain. Elias sat still, listening to the sound of a trunk latch being thrown. He heard the rustle of fabric. A moment later, Cora returned. She was holding a flat, oilskin packet. It was stained and worn, the edges fraying. It was the only thing she had insisted on bringing with her from Red Creek, guarding it more closely than her own life. She walked to the table and placed the packet on top of Elias's map. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely undo the string. She unfolded a document. It was thick, formal paper, stamped with the seal of the territory. Elias leaned forward. The firelight danced on the elegant script. It was a land deed, a federal grant for 300 acres of prime mountain grazing land. The description of the boundaries matched the valley on his map perfectly. And at the bottom, the name of the owner was written in a flowing, confident hand: Cora Jameson. Elias looked up at her. "Jameson?" "My father's name," Cora said. Her voice was thin, brittle as ice. "He was a prospector before he was a farmer. He found that valley 20 years ago. He never minded. He just loved it. He filed the claim and paid the taxes every year, even when we were starving. He said it was my dowry, my future." She looked at the map, her eyes filling with tears. "That valley is the reason Brett Kincaid married me." Elias felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the winter draft. He looked at the deed again. It was dated 4 years prior. "He knew about the land?" Elias asked. "He knew," Cora said. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly on her heels. "The Kincaids want water. They control the lower creek. But that valley, it feeds the whole system. If they owned it, they would own the water rights for the entire district. Brett came courting me when I was 18. He was charming. He brought flowers. He told me I was beautiful." She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "I was a fool. I thought he loved me. We were married. And the next day, the very next day, he put a paper in front of me. He wanted me to sign the deed over to the Kincaid Ranch." Elias watched her face. The mask of the capable pioneer woman had slipped, revealing the terrified girl beneath. "I refused," Cora whispered. It was the only thing my father left me. I said no. Brett laughed. He said he would get it one way or another. She took a deep breath, the air shuddering in her lungs. Then came his brother. Elias went still. He remembered the rumors in the saloon. Bad luck. Ruined. His name was Samuel, Cora said, staring into the fire as if she could see the memory burning there. He was worse than Brett. Meaner. One night, Brett went to town. Samuel came to the house. He cornered me in the kitchen. He said if I would not sign the paper for Brett, maybe I would sign it for him. He said I needed to be taught a lesson in obedience. She closed her eyes. He tore my dress. He pinned me against the table. I was so scared. I grabbed the carving knife. I did not mean to. I just wanted him to stop. I swung it. She opened her eyes. They were dark, bottomless pits of horror. I hit his neck. Elias. There was so much blood. He fell. He died right there on the floor. The silence in the cabin was total. The fire popped, a sound like a gunshot. Elias looked at her. He saw the way she stood, braced for judgment, braced for him to recoil. Brett came home and found us. Cora continued, her voice devoid of emotion now. He looked at Samuel. He looked at me. He did not cry for his brother. He smiled. He told me I was a murderer. He said the law would hang me. He said no jury would believe a woman against the Kincaid name. She looked at Elias, begging him to understand. He made a deal. He said he would hide the body. He would tell everyone Samuel rode off to Texas and got shot in a card game. In exchange, I had to belong to him. Completely. I had to do whatever he said. If I ever tried to leave, if I ever refused him, he would turn me in for murder. She pointed to the deed. He kept me because he still needed my signature. The law says a wife must sign freely to transfer inherited land. He spent 3 years trying to break me, trying to make me sign. He called me worthless. He told the town I was barren and crazy, so no one would listen if I talked. He kept me alive just for that paper. She slumped into the chair, burying her face in her hands. I am a murderer. Elias, that is why I am worthless. That is why I let him bet me. I thought it was my penance. Elias sat frozen, a fury, hot and white, ignited in his chest. It was not anger at Cora. It was a rage so profound it made his vision blur. He thought of Brett Kincaid, the laughing man at the poker table. He thought of the years of terror this woman had endured, trapped in a prison built of lies. He stood up slowly. He walked around the table. Cora flinched when he came near, but he did not touch her. He knelt beside her chair, forcing her to look at him. Look at me. Cora. She raised her head, her face wet with tears. You are not a murderer, Elias said. His voice was low, vibrating with conviction. I killed him. She sobbed. You defended yourself, Elias said. A man forces his way onto a woman. He forfeits his life. That is the law of nature. It is the law of God, even if it is not the law of the territory judges. He reached out and took her hands. They were cold as ice. Brett Kincaid is the criminal, Elias said. He used his brother's death to enslave you. He twisted the law to terrorize you. Cora shook her head. But the blood was on his hands, Elias interrupted firmly. Not yours. You survived. That is not a sin. Cora looked at him, her breath hitching. She had carried the weight of that word, murderer, for 3 years. It had defined her. It had been the chain around her neck. To hear Elias cast it aside, to hear him call it survival, felt like stepping out of a dark room into blinding sunlight. It was too bright. She could barely accept it. Self-defense, she whispered. Self-defense, Elias repeated. He held her gaze, refusing to let her look away, refusing to let her sink back into the shame. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind. Then, slowly, Cora's shoulders dropped. The tension that had held her upright for years seemed to snap. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against Elias's shoulder. He did not pull away. He stayed kneeling, offering the solid, unmoving wall of his presence. He let her weep, hot tears soaking into his flannel shirt. That night, the dynamic in the cabin shifted. The air was no longer thick with secrets. It was charged with something else. Cora watched Elias as he moved about the room. She watched the way his strong, scarred hands cradled his coffee mug, handling the ceramic with a surprising gentleness. She listened to the cadence of his voice, realizing that the roughness in it was not cruelty, but the rust of disuse. He had saved her, not just at the poker table, but tonight, with his words. Elias felt her eyes on him. He felt the weight of her trust. It was a heavy thing, heavier than the pack mule's load. He found himself conscious of his movements, wanting to be worthy of that look. 3 nights later, the mountain decided to remind them of its power. A storm rolled in from the north, a true blizzard that hammered the valley with winds that screamed like tortured souls. The cabin groaned under the assault. The heavy timbers creaked, and the shutters rattled against their latches. Elias was pacing the floor, checking the bolts on the door. Cora was sitting on her bunk in the back room, trying to read by the flickering light of a candle, but the noise was terrified. Suddenly, a crack like a cannon shot split the air. A massive ponderosa pine, its roots weakened by the shifting freeze and thaw, gave way on the slope above them. It crashed down, glancing off the corner of the cabin roof. The impact shook the entire structure. Dust and dried moss rained down from the ceiling. A ceramic jar fell from the shelf and shattered. Cora screamed. It was an instinctive, animal reaction to the violence of the sound. She ran from the back room, stumbling into the main area. She was barefoot, dressed only in her white shift and a shawl. Elias! He was there. He had turned from the door at the sound of the crash. He saw her face, white with terror, eyes wide. He did not think. He stepped forward and opened his arms. Cora collided with him. She buried her face in his chest, her hands clutching the back of his shirt. She was trembling so hard she vibrated against him. "It's all right," Elias said, his voice a rumble against her ear. "It's all right. The roof held. It was just a glancing blow." He wrapped his arms around her. It was a protective gesture, a shield against the falling timber and the howling wind. He held her tight, anchoring her to the floor, anchoring her to him. But as the echoes of the crash faded, the nature of the embrace changed. Cora felt the heat of him through the thin cotton of her shift. She smelled the scent of him, wood smoke, soap, and man. She felt the steady, powerful thump of his heart against her cheek. The terror began to recede, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming awareness of his body. She realized that for the first time in her life, a man's arms were not a trap. They were a shelter. She did not pull away. She pressed closer, her hands sliding up his back to the nape of his neck. She tilted her head back, looking up at him. Elias looked down. The firelight caught the hollow of her throat, the pulse beating there. He saw her lips, parted slightly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. He felt a surge of desire so strong it nearly knocked the wind out of him. He wanted her. He wanted to kiss the fear out of her. He wanted to carry her to the bed and show her that touch could be something other than violence. His hands tightened on her waist. He lowered his head, inches from hers. Cora's eyes fluttered shut. She waited, her heart hammering. She wanted him to bridge the gap. She wanted to be claimed, not by a wager, but by this man, in this storm. But Elias stopped. He froze. The memory of her story, of Samuel, of Brett, of the years of forced obedience, crashed into his desire. She is vulnerable, he told himself. She is scared. If I touch her now, if I take this, I am no better than them. I am just another man taking advantage of her fear. The thought was like a bucket of ice water, with a groan of effort that cost him more than any physical labor he had ever done. Elias loosened his hold. He stepped back. The separation was physical, a tearing of heat from heat. Cora's eyes snapped open. She looked at him, confused, her lips still swollen with the anticipation of a kiss that hadn't happened. Elias took a ragged breath. He ran a hand through his hair. "The roof is solid," he said, his voice rough and strained. You should go back to bed. You will freeze out here." Cora stood there, shivering in the draft. She saw the tension in his jaw. She saw the way his hands were clenched at his sides, fighting the urge to reach for her again. She understood. He was not rejecting her. He was protecting her. He was refusing to use her vulnerability against her. A profound ache settled in her chest. It was a mixture of disappointment and a soaring, terrifying hope. She had known men who took. She had never known a man who refrained. "Thank you, Elias," she whispered. She turned and walked back to the curtained room. She lay in the dark, her body humming with unspent adrenaline and desire, listening to the storm rage outside and the silence of the man who lay awake in the next room, guarding her honor even against himself. The days that followed were different. The air in the cabin was thick, heavy with things unsaid. The distance between them had vanished, replaced by a magnetic field that seemed to pull them together. When Elias handed her a tool, his fingers brushed hers, and they both lingered a second too long. When she poured his coffee, she stood close enough that her skirt brushed his knee, and neither of them moved away. They spoke in lower voices. They shared quiet laughter over the absurdity of a squirrel that kept trying to raid the woodshed. Cora found herself watching him constantly. She watched him shave, the razor revealing the strong line of his jaw. She watched him split wood, the easy power of his shoulders. She teased him one morning about his coffee, which was strong enough to float a horseshoe, if you make it any stronger. "Elias, we will not need to chew our food. We will just dissolve it," she said, smiling over the rim of her cup. Elias looked at her, a slow grin spreading through his beard. It was a rare expression, sunny and boyish. "Keeps the blood moving," he said. "Keeps the heart racing," she countered, holding his gaze. His eyes darkened. "Yours too?" he asked softly. Cora blushed, looking down. "Mine too." They were dancing on the edge of a precipice, terrifying and exhilarating. They were falling in love, quietly, steadily, like snow filling a valley. But the world outside the cabin had not forgotten them. Miles away, in Red Creek, the snow had temporarily blocked the main pass, but it had not blocked the rumors. Brett Kincaid had gone to the house to burn Cora's belongings, a final act of spite. He had found the trunk empty of the one thing that mattered. The hidden compartment where she kept the deed was bare. Panic had turned to cold, calculating fury. He realized she had not just run away. She had taken his future. She had the paper that proved the high meadow, and the water rights belonged to her. He stood in the saloon, surrounded by hard men, gun hands and trackers who did not care about the weather as long as the coin was gold. "She is on the mountain," Brett said, slamming a fist into his palm. "She is with that trapper. The pass is closed." "Boss," one of the men said. 10 feet of snow. Then we take the goat trail," Brett snarled. "We wait for the first break in the weather. I do not care if it takes a week or a month. I want that paper, and I want them dead." He looked out the frosted window toward the jagged peaks of the Bitter Ridge. "No one steals from a Kincaid," he whispered, "especially not a worthless wife." Up in the high valley, the wind howled, oblivious to the men gathering in the dark, plotting to bring fire and blood to the sanctuary of the snow. Late winter arrived not with a roar, but with a weeping. The relentless iron grip of the frost began to loosen, giving way to days when the sun struck the snow with a blinding, watery intensity. The silence of the high valley was broken by the sound of dripping. Thousands of tiny rivulets running down the bark of the pines, sliding off the eaves of the cabin and joining the creek, which roared louder and angrier beneath its fracturing crust of ice. The snow slumped heavily off the branches, falling in wet, thudding piles that sounded like footsteps. For Cora, the thaw brought a complex dread. The deep snow had been a prison, but it had also been a wall. It had kept the world out. Now, as the drifts receded and the black rock of the cliffs began to show through the white, she felt the exposure of the land. She stood on the porch one morning, watching the steam rise from the melting drifts. Elias was by the corral, checking the hooves of the roan horse. "Do you think they can get through?" she asked. Elias did not look up immediately. He ran his hand down the horse's hock, checking for heat. "The pass is still choked," he said. "A horse would flounder in belly-deep drifts, but the lower trails are opening." He dropped the horse's hoof and wiped his hands on a rag. He looked at her, seeing the tension in the set of her shoulders. "He will come," Cora said. It was not a question. "He will try," Elias corrected. "But trying and doing are different things in these mountains." He walked up the steps, the heavy wood thudding under his boots. He stopped beside her, close enough that she could smell the leather and horse sweat on him. "What happens if he finds us?" she asked, looking up at him. "What happens if he brings the law?" Elias looked out at the valley, his eyes narrowing against the glare of the snow. "He won't take you," Elias said. It was a simple statement, delivered with the flat certainty of a man stating that the sun would set in the west. He did not bluster or swear. He simply stated a fact. Cora looked at his profile, the gray in his beard, the scar that cut through his eyebrow, the hard line of his jaw. It frightened her, that certainty. It implied violence. It implied that he would stand between her and the entire world if he had to. But beneath the fear, there was a warmth that spread through her chest, a feeling of safety so profound it made her knees weak. 2 days later, the mountain reminded them that the thaw was as dangerous as the freeze. Elias had gone out early to check the beaver traps along the upper creek. The ice was treacherous, rotting from underneath where the water moved fast, but looking solid on the surface. Cora was inside, kneading dough for biscuits. When she heard the shout, it was not a cry of pain, but a sharp, angry bark of surprise, followed by silence. She wiped the flour from her hands and ran to the door. "Elias," she called. There was no answer. She grabbed her coat and the heavy buffalo robe, shoving her feet into her boots. She ran toward the creek, her breath tearing at her lungs in the thin air. She found him 300 yards upstream. He was lying on the bank, half in the water. One leg was twisted at a sickening angle beneath him. He was gripping the roots of a willow bush, his face gray and beaded with sweat. His teeth clenched so hard the muscles in his jaw jumped. "Elias!" She scrambled down the bank, slipping in the mud and slush. She grabbed his shoulder, trying to pull him out of the freezing water. "Leg," he gritted out. "Broken. Or damn near it." He tried to push himself up, but his boot slipped on the slick mud, and he let out a low groan that terrified her more than a scream would have. Elias Ward did not groan. "Don't move," Cora ordered, her voice shaking. "Let me help. I can walk." He lied. "Just help me up." He could not walk. When he tried to put weight on the left leg, his knee buckled, and he went down again, heavy as a felled tree. Cora realized with a jolt of terror that he was too heavy for her to carry. If he could not walk, he would freeze here. The sun was already dipping behind the ridge, and the temperature would plummet within the hour. "You have to lean on me," she said, jamming her shoulder under his armpit. "Elias, you have to move." It took them an hour to cover the 300 yards back to the cabin. It was a brutal, agonizing procession. Elias hopped on one leg, leaning his massive weight on Cora until she felt her own spine compressing. She gritted her teeth, digging her boots into the slush, refusing to let him fall. Every time he stumbled, she caught him, her small frame straining against his bulk. By the time they reached the porch, they were both soaked with sweat and shivering. Cora managed to get him through the door and onto the bed in the corner. She collapsed into the chair, gasping for air, her vision spotting. But there was no time to rest. Elias was in bad shape. The leg was swollen to the size of a stovepipe, the skin tight and angry. He was shivering violently, the shock setting in. Cora moved with a desperate focus. She built up the fire until it roared. She cut the boot off his foot, wincing at his sharp intake of breath. She packed the leg in snow to bring down the swelling and bound it tight with strips of linen. For the next 3 days, the mountain's indifference became a living presence in the room. Elias Ward, the man who could survive anything, was helpless. And Cora, the woman who had been called worthless, became his lifeline. She took over everything. She rose in the dark to chop wood, the heavy axe feeling clumsy in her hands at first. She learned to swing with her back, not her arms, splitting the pine logs with a grunt of effort. She hauled water from the creek, breaking the new ice with a rock. She checked the snares, bringing back a brace of rabbits and skinning them with hands that no longer trembled at the sight of blood. She barred the door at night and slept with Elias's rifle leaning against her chair. Every howl of a wolf, every creak of the settling logs, made her jump. She realized how much she had come to depend on his silent, steady strength. Now, she had to be the strength for both of them. On the fourth night, the fever came. It started with a restlessness. Elias tossed on the narrow bed, kicking off the quilts. His skin was hot and dry to the touch. By midnight, he was delirious. Cora sat beside him, bathing his forehead with a rag dipped in snow water. He muttered in his sleep, his voice thick and unrecognizable. "Sarah," he whispered. "Sarah, the smoke is too thick." Cora paused, the rag hovering over his brow. "I can't find the door," he groaned, thrashing. "Get out! You have to get out!" Cora placed a hand on his chest, pushing him gently back onto the mattress. "Shh," she whispered. "You are safe. There is no fire." But he was not in the cabin. He was 20 years in the past, in a place of horror she had never known. "I got there too late," he rasped, a tear leaking from the corner of his eye and tracking through the dust on his cheek. "They burned it all. Sarah, I got there too late." Cora felt a piercing sorrow. She had always seen him as a monolith, a creature of rock and silence, untouched by the world. She realized now that he was as scarred as she was. He had loved someone. He had lost them to violence. He carried a guilt that had driven him up into the clouds to live alone. She leaned close, brushing the damp hair back from his forehead. "You are not alone now," she whispered fiercely. "I am here. I am not leaving." She stayed by his side all night, whispering stories from her childhood to distract him from the demons in his head. She told him about the farm in Nebraska, about the way the corn looked in August, about the cat she had named Buster. She poured her voice into the darkness, a tether to keep him from drifting away. When dawn broke, the fever finally snapped. Elias opened his eyes. They were clear, the glassy sheen of infection gone. He blinked, looking up at the timbered ceiling, then turned his head to look at her. Cora was asleep in the chair, her head resting on the edge of the mattress, her hand clutching his. He watched her for a long time. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the soot on her cheek, the roughness of her hands. She had kept him alive. The woman who had been wagered for $500 had carried him through the fire. He moved his hand, his fingers brushing hers. Cora woke instantly. She sat up, her eyes wide. "Elias? I am here," he rasped. His throat was dry as sand. Cora let out a breath that was half a sob. She reached for the water dipper and held it to his lips. He drank greedily. "You talked," she said quietly, setting the dipper down. "In your fever." Elias looked at the ceiling. "Sarah?" Cora nodded. "My wife. He said 20 years ago, in Wyoming. We had a homestead, caught in the middle of a range war. I was away buying seed. When I came back, there was nothing left but ashes." He turned his eyes to Cora. The vulnerability in them was raw, terrifying. "I never told anyone that, not in 20 years. Cora reached out and took his hand again. Her touch was firm. "We both have ghosts. Elias. But we are the ones still breathing." The days that followed the fever were quiet, but the air in the cabin had changed. The formality was gone. They had seen each other at their weakest. Cora terrified of the storm. Elias broken by fever, and they had not looked away. Elias's leg healed slowly. He could hobble around the cabin on a crutch he whittled from a branch, but he spent most of his time sitting by the fire, mending gear while Cora worked. One evening, the wind died down, leaving the valley in a breathless, crystalline silence. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing coals that pulsed like a heartbeat. Elias was sitting on the edge of the bed. Cora was sitting on the rug near his feet, sorting beans. She stopped her work. She looked at the fire, then at him. She stood up and moved to sit beside him on the edge of the bed. It was a bold move. They were close enough that their shoulders brushed. Elias went still. He held his breath, afraid that if he moved, He would shatter the moment. Cora turned to face him. She reached out and took his hand, his large, scarred hand that had killed wolves and built walls. She lifted it and placed it palm flat over her heart. "Can you feel that?" she whispered. Elias felt the rapid, fluttering beat of her heart beneath the rough fabric of her dress. It was racing, hammering against his palm like a trapped bird. "I feel it," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm afraid," Cora said softly. "I'm afraid of the winter. I'm afraid of Brett. I'm afraid that I am broken inside." She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. "But I am not afraid of you." She pressed his hand harder against her chest. "I want to choose this. Elias, I want to choose you. Not because you saved me, not because I owe you a debt for the food or the roof. I am tired of being touched only in anger. I am tired of being owned. I want to give something of my own free will." Her words were shaky, but her chin was high. It was the bravest thing he had ever seen. Elias looked at her face, searching for any sign of doubt, any flicker of the trauma that Brett had inflicted on her. He saw only open, honest longing. He moved his other hand, cupping her cheek gently. His thumb brushed the line of her jaw, erasing the memory of the bruise that had been there months ago. He held her as if she were made of spun glass, precious and fragile. "Cora," he whispered. He leaned in. The kiss was not like the kisses in the dime novels. It was slow, hesitant, a question asked and answered in the dark. It tasted of coffee and wood smoke and fear. But then Cora made a small sound in her throat and leaned into him, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders. The hesitation vanished. The kiss deepened, becoming hungry and desperate. It was a release of months of terror, months of loneliness. It was a reclaiming. For Cora, it was the first time she had been kissed by a man who asked for permission. For Elias, it was the first time in 20 years he had felt the warmth of a woman without the shadow of a ghost standing between them. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her small frame. She buried her hands in his hair, pulling him down. They broke apart only when they needed air, their foreheads resting against each other. "Elias," she breathed. He kissed her eyelids, her nose, the corner of her mouth. They did not go further. The weight of the moment was enough. They lay down together on the narrow bed, fully clothed, wrapped in the quilts. Elias held her against his chest, his chin resting on the top of her head. Cora listened to the steady rhythm of his heart, slower and stronger than hers. They slept like that, holding each other against the cold and the dark. It was more intimate than any act of passion could have been. It was a promise. It was an acknowledgement that they were two broken things that fit together to make something whole. The next week was a golden time. The thaw continued. The creek broke free of its ice completely, rushing with a joyful noise. They moved around each other with a new ease. There was a shyness. Yes, glances that lingered and then darted away. Smiles that hid behind coffee cups. But there was also laughter. One morning, Cora threw a snowball at him when he came back from the shed. It hit him square in the shoulder. Elias stopped, stunned. He looked at the snow on his coat, then at Cora, who was standing on the porch, giggling with her hand over her mouth. "Oh, you are looking for a fight," he said, a grin cracking his face. He scooped up a handful of snow. Cora shrieked and ran inside, slamming the door. He heard her laughing on the other side. It was a sound that belonged to a different life, a life they were slowly, painstakingly building, but the mountains do not allow for endless peace. Elias was mending a bridle on the porch one afternoon when he stopped. His hands froze on the leather. He lifted his head, sniffing the air. Cora came out, drying her hands on her apron. "What is it?" she asked, seeing the change in his posture. Elias stood up, ignoring the twinge in his healing leg. He pointed toward the southern ridge, where the trail from the lower valley crested the pass. "Look." Cora squinted against the sun. At first, she saw nothing. Then, she saw it, a thin, gray smudge against the deep blue of the sky. "Smoke," she whispered. "Campfire," Elias said grimly. "Green wood, someone who does not care if they are seen." He walked to the edge of the porch and looked down at the snowfield that led up to the pass. He had not been down there in weeks because of his leg. I see tracks. He said. Cora followed his gaze. Far below, near the tree line, there were dark depressions in the snow. They were too spaced out to be elk. They were horses, riders. They found the lower trail. Elias said, "The thaw opened it up sooner than I thought." The blood drained from Cora's face. The laughter of the morning seemed a million miles away. "It is him," she said. Elias turned to her. His face was hard again. The lover gone. The mountain man back in charge. "Get the rifles," he said. They spent the next hour in a frantic, controlled preparation. Elias checked the loads in his Winchester and the heavy buffalo gun he kept for bears. He showed Cora where the extra ammunition was stored in a tin box under the floorboards. He laid out a map on the table. "There is a ravine behind the cabin," he said, tracing a line with his finger. "It is steep, but it leads up into the rockfall. Horses cannot follow. If they breach the door, you go out the back window. You run for that rocks. Do you understand?" Cora grabbed his arm. "We should run now," she pleaded. "Elias, we can take the horses. We can go higher. We cannot outrun fresh horses in deep snow," Elias said, shaking his head. "And with my leg, I would slow you down. They would run us down in an hour." "Then I am not leaving," Cora said fiercely. "We fight from here," Elias said. "The cabin is strong. The walls are thick. They have to cross open ground to get to us." He looked at her, his eyes intense. "If they come, Cora, you shoot. You do not hesitate. You do not think about who they are. You aim for the center of the chest." "I know," she whispered. "I know." The afternoon dragged on, agonizingly slow. The sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the snow. The valley, usually so beautiful at twilight, now looked like a bruising. Elias stood at the window, peering through the crack in the shutter. Cora sat at the table, her hand gripping the heavy Colt revolver he had given her. "They are here," Elias said softly. Cora moved to the window. On the ridge above the cabin, silhouetted against the dying light, sat 5 riders. They were motionless, like statues carved from darkness, even at this distance. Cora knew the figure in the center. She knew the slope of his shoulders, the arrogance of the way he sat his horse. "Brett," he raised a hand, signaling to the men beside him. They began to descend the slope, their horses wading through the snow, moving slowly, inevitably toward the cabin. The sanctuary was breached. The world had found them. Elias turned from the window and looked at Cora. He did not say a word. He just reached out and squeezed her shoulder, a touch that said, "I am here and I am sorry," all at once. Then he picked up his rifle and jacked a shell into the chamber. The metallic clack-clack was the loudest sound in the world. "Stay low," he said. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, moaning through the trees, carrying the scent of enemies to their door. The voice that drifted down from the ridge was familiar, a lazy, jagged drawl that scraped against Cora's nerves like a rusty knife. "Cora, darlin'," Brett called out. The wind carried his voice, thinning it, but the arrogance remained heavy and intact. "Why don't you come on out? It is cold up here, and I am losing my patience." Inside the cabin, the air went still. The warmth of the hearth, which only moments ago had felt like a sanctuary, now felt fragile, a thin bubble about to burst. Cora stood by the table, her hand pressing against her bodice. Beneath the layers of wool and cotton, the oilskin packet rested against her skin. The deed, the paper that proved she was not a beggar, but an owner. It felt hot, like a brand. Elias moved. He did not run. He moved with the heavy, deliberate grace of a bear shifting its weight. He stepped between Cora and the heavy oak door, his rifle held loose but ready across his chest. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a slow, deep thudding that he could feel in his throat. But his hands were steady. "Stay away from the windows," Elias said. His voice a low rumble meant only for her. He raised his voice, pitching it to carry through the thick timber walls. "She is not coming out." "Kincaid," a laugh answered him, sharp and incredulous. "Is that the mountain man?" Brett shouted. "You sound like you have a frog in your throat," Ward. Or maybe that is just fear. Send her out. She has something of mine, a piece of paper she took by mistake. We will take that, and her, and be on our way. She has nothing of yours, Elias roared back. The deed is in her name, and she is a free woman. I have the paper you signed in the saloon, witnessed and dated. You relinquished all claim. There was a pause. The wind whistled through the eaves. Then, Brett's laughter returned. Harder this time. That was a joke. You fool, a drunken tavern jest. Do you think a judge in this territory will honor a scrap of paper signed by a man in his cups? Over the word of a Kincaid? Do you think anyone will believe a savage and a ruined, barren wife over me? Cora flinched. The words were old wounds. Reopened. Ruined. Barren. I am going to count to 10, Brett yelled. If she is not on the porch, we burn you out. I will turn that woodpile into a bonfire with both of you inside it. Elias looked at Cora. His eyes were hard, the gray in them like steel. He means it, Elias said softly. Cora nodded. She gripped the heavy Colt revolver Elias had given her. It was heavy in her hands, a cold weight of iron. I am not going back, she whispered. I would rather burn. Elias's jaw tightened. He looked at the door, calculating the angles. Get behind the table, he ordered. Turn it over. Now. Cora scrambled to the heavy oak table. She shoved it, the legs screeching against the floorboards, and tipped it onto its side facing the door. She crouched behind it, the wood solid and thick against her back. 1, Brett shouted from the hill. Elias moved to the window, peering through the crack in the shutter. He saw them. 5 dark shapes against the snow. They were fanning out, moving toward the cabin in a loose semicircle. Rifles raised. 2! Elias raised his buffalo gun. He did not aim for Brett. He aimed for the man on the far left, who was moving toward the cover of the woodshed. 3! Elias squeezed the trigger. The boom of the heavy rifle was deafening in the small space. It sounded like the cabin itself had cracked in half. Outside, the man by the woodshed spun around, his rifle flying into the snow, and collapsed clutching his thigh. The scream that followed tore through the twilight. They are shooting, someone yelled. Kill them! The countdown ended instantly, replaced by the roar of gunfire. Bullets slammed into the cabin. They punched through the shutters, sending splinters of pine flying across the room like shrapnel. One round thudded into the door, leaving a pockmark of fresh, white wood. Another shattered the lantern on the mantel, spilling oil that luckily did not catch. Elias worked the lever of his rifle. He fired again, then ducked as a hail of lead chewed up the window frame. Reload! He shouted to Cora, tossing a box of cartridges across the floor. Cora's hands were shaking so badly she dropped the first shell. She scrambled for it, her fingers clumsy. The noise was terrifying, a chaotic cacophony of cracks, thuds, and the high-pitched whine of ricochets. But beneath the terror, a cold, hard anger began to crystallize in her gut. She picked up the cartridge. She slid it into the loading gate of the spare Winchester Elias had left beside her. She did it again and again. She looked up, through a gap in the chinking between the logs. She saw movement. A man was crouching low, running toward the side of the cabin where there were no windows. He was carrying a torch, a thick branch wrapped in oil-soaked rags, flaming bright orange against the blue dusk. He is flanking us, Cora screamed. The south wall! Elias was pinned down at the window, trading shots with 2 men on the ridge. He could not move without exposing himself. Take him! Elias roared. Cora looked at the Colt in her hand. She looked at the man with the torch. He was getting closer. He was going to set the fire right against the dry logs of the corner. She realized, with a sudden, crystal clarity, that no one was coming to save her. Not the sheriff, not her father, not God. It was just her. She crawled to the side of the room, dragging herself along the floorboards. There was a small ventilation port near the floor, blocked by a sliding piece of wood. She kicked it open. The cold air rushed in. She saw the man's boots. He was 20 feet away. Cora lifted the heavy pistol. She used both hands to steady it. She did not think about the man's name. She did not think about his family. She thought about the fire. She thought about the cabin burning down around them. She pulled the hammer back. The click was lost in the noise outside. She aimed low, closing her eyes for a split second. Then, opening them, she pulled the trigger. The gun bucked violently, jarring her wrists up to her shoulders. The smoke stung her eyes. Outside, the man yelped, a high, surprised sound. He dropped the torch into the snow, where it hissed and sputtered. He grabbed his arm, stumbling backward, spinning in a circle. "I hit him!" Cora yelled, shock ringing in her voice. "I hit him! Good girl!" Elias shouted. "Keep watching that side." But the victory was short-lived. Brett, seeing his flanker fall, lost whatever shred of patience he had left. "Burn it!" he screamed, his voice cracking with rage. "Throw the torches! Burn the rats out!" A moment later, something heavy thudded onto the roof. Then another hit the porch. The smell of smoke changed. It was no longer the pleasant scent of the hearth. It was the acrid, choking smell of pitch and dry timber catching flame. The cabin, built of seasoned pine, was a tinderbox. The fire caught on the porch roof and raced upward. Orange light began to flicker through the cracks in the door. The heat inside rose instantly. "They are burning the roof," Elias said. He sounded calm, but his face was grim. "We have to go." "Go where?" Cora coughed, the smoke beginning to pool near the ceiling. "The back," Elias said. He ran to the rear wall of the cabin, behind the curtain that separated the sleeping area. He shoved the heavy chest of drawers aside with a grunt of exertion. Behind it, the logs had been cut. It was a bolt hole, a section of wall designed to swing outward, hidden from the outside by a stack of firewood. Elias kicked the latch free. He put his shoulder to the wood and shoved. The section of wall groaned, then swung open, spilling firewood into the snow outside. The cold air rushed in, feeding the fire behind them. The roar of the flames was becoming deafening. "Go," Elias ordered. "Keep to the shadows of the trees. Head for the ravine." Cora scrambled through the opening. She fell into the snow, the cold biting at her hands. She scrambled up and waited for Elias. He came through behind her, clutching his rifle. But as he emerged, a silhouette appeared on the ridge above them. One of Brett's men had circled around. "There!" the man shouted. A gunshot cracked. Elias jerked violently. He stumbled, falling to one knee in the snow. He let out a sharp hiss of breath. "Elias!" Cora grabbed his coat. "I am fine," he grunted. "Run!" He pushed himself up, but his movement was hitched, pained. He clamped his hand to his side. Dark blood began to seep between his fingers, staining the buffalo coat. Cora grabbed his arm, pulling him. The fire from the cabin was roaring now, turning the night into a chaotic dance of orange light and black shadows. Sparks rose into the sky, swirling like angry fireflies. They ran. It was a nightmare of stumbling through knee-deep drifts, their breath tearing at their lungs. The trees offered some cover, but the light from the burning cabin exposed them. Bullets clipped the branches around them. Bark exploded near Cora's face. They reached the edge of the steep ravine that Elias had marked as their escape route. It was a narrow, choked slash in the earth, filled with loose rock and scree. "Down here," Elias gasped. His face was pale, illuminated by the firelight behind them. They slid down the slope, sending cascades of rocks tumbling into the dark. At the bottom, the ravine twisted sharply, cutting off the line of sight from the cabin. They paused for a second, leaning against the rock wall, gasping for air. Elias checked his side. The bullet had furrowed along his ribs, a graze, but a deep one. It bled freely, soaking his shirt. "We cannot stop," he said. "They will track us." They started to move down the ravine, but the sound of hooves clattered on the rock above. "They are cutting us off," Cora whispered. Brett's men knew the terrain better than Elias had hoped. They were riding along the rim, looking for a way down. Suddenly, a man appeared at the top of the ravine, 30 yards ahead of them. He dismounted, sliding his rifle from its scabbard. He began to scramble down the slope, blocking their path. "We are trapped," Cora said, panic rising in her throat. Elias raised his rifle, but his hands were shaking from the shock of the wound. Cora looked up. The wall of the ravine above the man was unstable. a jumble of loose boulders and shale, held back by the frost and a few precarious roots. She saw a large, rounded boulder, the size of a wagon wheel, teetering on a ledge of frozen mud just above the path the man was descending. She did not have a weapon that could reach him, but she had the land. She grabbed a heavy branch lying in the snow, a piece of deadfall. She jammed it under a smaller rock that acted as the keystone for the pile near them. "Help me," she gritted out. Elias saw what she was doing. He added his weight to the branch. They heaved. The rock shifted. With a grinding crack, the slope gave way. It started as a trickle of pebbles, then a slide of shale. The large boulder above the man wobbled, tipped, and fell. It gathered speed instantly, bouncing off the canyon wall. The man looked up. He screamed, a short, sharp sound. He tried to scramble back up, but the loose shale offered no purchase. The boulder struck the slope just above him, triggering a landslide of rock and snow. It swept him away. He disappeared under a cloud of dust and white powder. There was a sickening crunch, followed by a silence that was heavier than the gunshot. Then, from beneath the pile of rocks, a low, gurgling moan drifted up. "Help me!" Cora dropped the branch. She stared at the pile of rocks. She covered her mouth with her hands. She had done that. She had crushed a man. He is hurt," she whispered, horrified. Elias grabbed her arm. His grip was hard. "He came to kill us, Cora, but he is suffering," she said, tears springing to her eyes. "We cannot help him," Elias said grimly, "and if we stay, his friends will do worse to us. Move!" He pulled her away. Cora stumbled after him, looking back over her shoulder at the pile of rocks. The moaning continued, a sound that would haunt her nightmares for years. But she kept moving. She had to. They limped through the night. The adrenaline faded, replaced by a cold, aching exhaustion. Elias leaned heavily on Cora, his weight bowing her shoulders. Every step was a battle. The wind bit at their faces. The temperature dropped. They were walking through a frozen hell, leaving a trail of blood drops in the snow. Sometime before dawn, they found the old trapper's shack. It was little more than a lean-to against a cliff face, abandoned years ago. The roof was half collapsed, but it offered shelter from the wind. They collapsed inside. Elias sank to the dirt floor, his face gray. Cora tore strips from her petticoat to bind his ribs tighter. "We have to make the road," Elias whispered. His eyes closed. "The main freight road. It is 2 miles south." "Rest," Cora said, brushing the hair from his forehead. "Just rest for an hour." She sat beside him, shivering, listening to his shallow breathing. She held the deed against her chest. It felt like a curse now. People were bleeding for it. Men were dying for it. When the sun finally rose, painting the sky in indifferent shades of pink and gold, they started moving again. They reached the freight road just as the sun cleared the peaks. It was a rutted track, churned to mud by heavy wagons. They heard the jingle of harness before they saw the mules. A heavy freight wagon, piled high with timber, came lumbering around the bend. The driver was an old man with a beard like steel wool and a face carved from walnut. He wore a battered hat pulled low. Cora stepped into the road, waving her arms. "Stop, please!" The driver pulled back on the reins. "Whoa!" The mules shuddered to a halt, steam rising from their flanks. The driver peered down at them. His eyes narrowed as he recognized her. "Well now," he spat, shifting a wad of tobacco in his cheek. "If it isn't the Kincaid woman, the runaway." He looked her up and down with open disgust. "They say you ran off to live in sin," he said, his voice thick with judgment. "An adulterous woman is a blight on the land. That is what the good book says." Cora straightened her spine. She was dirty, her face streaked with soot and tears, her dress torn, but she did not look down. "We need a ride to Red Creek," she said clearly. The driver scoffed. "I don't haul trash." Then he saw Elias. He saw the blood soaking the side of the buffalo coat. He saw the gray pallor of the mountain man's face. "Elias Ward?" the driver asked. Surprised. You look like you went through a meat grinder." "I need a ride. Jeb," Alias rasped. The driver hesitated. He looked at Cora with contempt. "But the code of the road was strong. You didn't leave a man bleeding in the snow, even if he was keeping bad company." "Get in the back," the driver grunted. "But don't expect me to make conversation. I don't hold with what you two have done. Breaking a marriage vow is a fast track to hellfire." "Thank you," Cora said stiffly. She helped Elias climb into the back of the wagon, settling him among the rough-cut timbers. She climbed in beside him. The wagon lurched forward, the iron wheels grinding against the stones. The ride was brutal. Every bump sent a jolt of pain through Elias. Cora held his hand, bracing him against the sway of the wagon. She looked at the back of the driver's head. She could hear him muttering to himself, words like harlot and disgrace drifting back on the wind. Inside Cora, something finally snapped. She looked at the deed in her pocket. She looked at Elias's blood on her hands. She thought about the man under the rocks. She thought about Brett's laughter. She was tired. She was so incredibly tired of being afraid. She was tired of the shame. She squeezed Elias's hand. "Elias," she said softly. He opened his eyes. "I am done," she said. "Done. I am done hiding. I am done feeling guilty. I am done letting them tell me who I am." She looked toward the town that was slowly drawing closer. "Let them call me a whore. Let them call me a murderer. I do not care anymore. I know what I am, and I know what Brett is." She looked at Elias. "I am ready to face them, even if they hang me. At least I will stand on my own 2 feet when they do it. I will not cower behind Brett's lies 1 minute longer." Elias looked at her. He saw the steel in her spine. The fear was gone, burned away by the fire of the cabin. He squeezed her hand back. His grip was weak, but his eyes were fierce. "You won't stand alone," he promised. "I will stand right beside you." "But what about your past?" Cora asked. "You ran away too." Elias looked at the sky. "I am done running," he said. "Let the ghosts come. I have something real to fight for now." They arrived in Red Creek just past noon. The town was buzzing. The wagon rolled down the main street, and heads turned. People stopped on the boardwalks, pointing and whispering. "There she is," someone shouted. The wagon ground to a halt in front of the sheriff's office. Cora helped Elias down. They stood in the mud, swaying slightly. They looked up at the saloon across the street. Brett Kincaid was standing on the porch. He was clean. He was dressed in a fresh suit. He was holding a glass of whiskey. He looked down at them, a smile spreading across his face. It was the smile of a man who had already written the ending of the play. "Well, well," Brett called out, his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Look who crawled out of the mountains. The prodigal wife returns, and she brought her pet wolf." He stepped down into the street. A crowd began to gather behind him. Men from the ranch, town drunks, curious shopkeepers. They formed a semicircle, pressing in. "Sheriff," Brett shouted, "come do your duty. I have found the man who tried to kill me." The sheriff, a man named Miller with a weak chin and eyes that shifted too much, stepped out of his office. He looked at Brett, then at Elias and Cora. He looked nervous. "Brett," he said, "you said they were dead. I said they attacked me." Brett lied smoothly. "They ambushed us at the cabin. They shot poor Grimshaw in the leg. We barely escaped with our lives. That man is a maniac. And that woman." He looked at Cora with a performance of deep sorrow. "My poor wife. She has lost her mind. She has been brainwashed by this savage. She needs to be in an asylum." "Liar!" Cora's voice rang out. It was clear and strong. The crowd went quiet. Women didn't call men liars in the street. "He is a liar." Cora stepped forward. "He burned the cabin. He tried to kill us." Brett shook his head sadly. "See, she is hysterical. Sheriff, arrest that man for attempted murder and kidnapping, and take my wife into custody for her own safety." Elias stepped forward, limping but upright. He put his hand on his gun belt. "If you touch her—" "Sheriff," Elias said, his voice gravel and death, "you better be ready to use that iron." The sheriff put his hand on his own gun. "Now. Ward, don't be foolish. "I demand a hearing," Brett shouted. "Right now. I want the town to see this. I want justice." He looked at the crowd, playing to them. "This man stole my wife. He stole my land. He tried to kill me. Are we going to let a mountain rat dictate the law to decent people? No!" Someone shouted from the back, "Hang him!" Another yelled. The mood was turning ugly. It was the mood of a mob. The sheriff looked at the crowd, then at Brett. He knew where the power lay. "All right," the sheriff said. "We will hold a hearing. In the saloon. Right now. We will settle this." He looked at Elias. "Hand over your gun, Ward, or you die right here in the street." Elias hesitated. He looked at Cora. She nodded. "Do it," she whispered. "We will beat him with the truth." Elias slowly unbuckled his gun belt. He handed it to the sheriff. "Fine," Elias said. "Let's have your hearing. But remember this, Brett." He looked the rancher in the eye. "The truth burns hotter than any fire." Brett just laughed. "The truth is what I say it is. Mountain Man." He turned and walked into the saloon. The crowd surged after him, hungry for the show. The street filled with the sharp, excited whispers of people who smelled blood in the water. Cora took Elias's arm. They walked toward the saloon doors, into the lion's den, leaving bloody footprints in the mud behind them. The Golden Nugget Saloon had been stripped of its joy. The poker tables were shoved against the walls, the sawdust on the floor swept into corners, and the piano lid closed like a coffin. In the center of the room, a makeshift platform had been erected using beer crates and rough-hewn planks. It was a stage for a tragedy, and the whole town of Red Creek had turned out to watch the final act. The air was thick, not with smoke this time, but with the heavy, sweating heat of too many bodies packed into a small space. Miners with coal dust in their creases stood shoulder to shoulder with shopkeepers in stiff collars. Women in bonnets craned their necks from the back, their whispers sounding like the rustle of dry leaves. Cora stood alone near the bar. Her wrists were bound in front of her with a length of rough hemp rope. Her dress, the one she had worn since the flight from the cabin, was stained with mud and soot, the hem ragged where it had dragged through the snow. A dark bruise was blooming on her cheekbone, a souvenir from the rough handling of the deputies who had pulled her from the wagon. She kept her head high, but she could feel the eyes of the town crawling over her. She heard the words they muttered under their breath, sharp and poisonous. Whore, murderer, ungrateful. She ran off with a savage and look where it got her. The gossip coiled around her throat like a noose, tightening with every whisper. These were people she had bought flour from, people she had nodded to in church on the rare occasions Brett allowed her to go. They did not see a survivor standing before them. They saw a scandal. They saw a woman who had broken the cardinal rule of the frontier. She had left her husband. Brett Kincaid stood on the platform, looking every inch the aggrieved patriarch. He had slicked back his hair and brushed the dust from his coat. He stood with one hand on his hip, the other resting on the railing, projecting an air of weary nobility. Sheriff Miller stood between them, looking like a man who wished he were anywhere else on God's green earth. He wiped his forehead with a stained handkerchief, his eyes darting toward the front row where Brett's father, the formidable ranch baron, sat with a face like carved granite. "Let us get this over with," the sheriff muttered. "This is an informal hearing to determine the disposition of Mrs. Kincaid and the charges against Mr. Ward. Brett, say your piece." Brett stepped forward. He pitched his voice low and mournful. "Playing to the women in the crowd. Neighbors," he began. "You all know me. You know my family. We have built this town up from the dirt. I took Cora in when she had nothing. I gave her a home. I gave her my name. And how did she repay me?" He pointed a finger at Cora, his face twisting into a mask of pained betrayal. "She ran off with a drifter, a violent man who seduced her with lies and whiskey. When I rode out to bring her home, to save her from her own madness, they ambushed us. They shot my men. They burned the cabin to the ground to cover their tracks. I am lucky to be alive." A murmur of sympathy rippled through the room. "She is not herself." "Sheriff," Brett continued, his voice cracking theatrically, She is sick in the head. She needs to be committed to an asylum where she cannot hurt herself or anyone else. And that man," he pointed at Elias, who stood silently by the door, guarded by 2 deputies. "That man is a kidnapper and an attempted murderer. He should hang." The crowd grumbled its agreement. "Hang him," someone shouted from the back. The sheriff looked at Elias, then at Cora. He cleared his throat. "Cora Kincaid, do you have anything to say? And mind your tongue. Woman, we want the truth." Cora stepped forward. The rope chafed her wrists. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the baker, the seamstress, the blacksmith. She saw no kindness there, only a hunger for the spectacle of her ruin. Her voice shook when she started, barely a whisper. "I did run away." She said. "Aha!" Brett shouted. "She admits it." Cora raised her voice, finding a reservoir of strength she did not know she possessed. It was the strength of the mountains, cold and unyielding. "I ran away because I was sold," she cried out. The room went deadly silent. "I was not seduced," she said, her voice gaining power. "I was wagered. In this very room. At that table right there." She pointed to the poker table shoved against the wall. "Brett Kincaid bet me on a hand of cards because he had lost all his money and was too proud to walk away. He valued me at $500. And he lost." Laughter bubbled up from the miners. A nervous, shocked sound. Brett flushed a deep, angry red. "She is lying," Brett snapped. "She is delirious. I am not lying." Cora turned to face the crowd. "But that is not the worst of it. He did not marry me for love. He married me for a deed. And he kept me by blackmail." She took a deep breath. The secret she had carried for 3 years, the secret that had been her cage, was about to be broken. 3 years ago, his brother Samuel came to our house when Brett was away. He forced his way in. He tried to hurt me. I grabbed a carving knife. I was terrified. I swung it. A gasp went through the room. The women pressed their hands to their mouths. "I killed him," Cora said, the words falling like stones. "Murderous," a woman shouted. "I defended myself," Cora screamed back, tears stinging her eyes. "But Brett, he came home and found us. He did not call the sheriff. He did not tell you the truth. He told me I was a murderer. He told me I would hang. He used his brother's death to own me. He said if I ever tried to leave, if I ever refused to sign over my land, he would turn me in." She looked at Brett, her eyes burning with a hatred so pure it felt like a cleansing fire. "He called me worthless. He called me barren. He made me believe I was nothing. But I am not nothing. I am a survivor. And I am done hiding for him." The crowd shifted. The mood was no longer uniform. Men were looking at Brett with narrowed eyes. They knew Brett's temper. They knew the Kincaid arrogance. The story had the ring of a dirty truth. "That is enough," Brett roared. Stepping off the platform, "She is making up stories. She killed my brother in cold blood, and now she is trying to slander me." Elias stepped forward. The deputies tried to block him, but he simply walked through them, his shoulder checking one man into the wall with a dull thud. "Let him speak," the blacksmith shouted from the crowd. Elias walked to the center of the room. He did not look at the crowd. He looked only at Cora. "I found her in this saloon," Elias said, his voice a low rumble that reached the rafters. "She was bruised. She was terrified. I saw the way he treated her, like a dog he wanted to kick." He turned to the sheriff. "I am a mountain man. Sheriff, I read sign. I know the difference between a predator and prey. This woman is not a killer. She is a wounded thing that fought back." His voice cracked slightly. "A fissure in the granite. I took her to the mountain to keep her safe. And I watched her work. I watched her bleed to build a life. She saved me when I was broke down. She is the bravest person I have ever known." He looked at Cora, and for a moment, the room disappeared. It was just the two of them by the fire. "I love her," Elias said simply. "Not because I won her, but because she is worth more than every acre of land in this valley." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded, stained piece of paper. "You want proof?" Elias asked. "Here." He slammed the paper onto the sheriff's desk. "That is the agreement Brett Kincaid signed the night of the poker game." It says he relinquishes all claim. It is witnessed by your own barkeep." The sheriff picked up the paper. He squinted at it. "Silas," the sheriff barked. "Get over here." The barkeep, a balding man who had been trying to make himself invisible behind the counter, shuffled forward. He looked at Brett, who was glaring at him with lethal intent. Then he looked at Elias, who stood like a Judgment Day totem. Silas looked at the paper. He swallowed hard. "Is this your signature, Silas?" the sheriff asked. Silas looked at his boots. Then he looked up, finding a scrap of courage. "It is. Sheriff, and did Brett Kincaid sign this?" Silas nodded. "He did. He bet her on a pair of 2 pair, and he lost." The room erupted. The laughter was louder now, mocking. To bet a wife was a sin. To lose her on 2 pair was a joke. Brett looked around, his eyes wild. He was losing them. He could feel the power slipping away like sand. "It was a drunkard's scrawl," he shouted. "It means nothing." Cora stepped forward again. "I have one more paper," she said. She reached into the bodice of her dress, her bound hands making the movement awkward. She pulled out the oilskin packet. She unfolded the deed. "This is the deed to the high meadow," she said, holding it up. "The valley above the Bitter Ridge. The Kincaids have wanted it for years. They want the water rights." She turned the paper so the room could see the bold script at the bottom. "It is granted to Cora Jameson. My father left it to me. Not to Brett. To me." A murmur of realization went through the crowd. Water rights, in cattle country. Water was more valuable than gold. Suddenly, the story of the grieving husband dissolved, replaced by the ugly reality of a land grab. Brett. Seeing the deed, the object of his obsession, dangled in front of the town. Finally snapped. The mask of the gentleman rancher shattered, revealing the brute beneath. "Give me that!" he screamed. He lunged across the space between them. He grabbed Cora's wrist, twisting it violently. Cora cried out, but she did not let go. "You thief!" Brett shrieked. "You lying, worthless bitch!" He drew back his hand and struck her. The sound of the slap was loud, wet, and shocking. It echoed in the silence of the saloon. Cora stumbled back, falling to her knees, blood welling from her split lip. That single blow shifted the entire room. The women in the crowd flinched as if they had been struck themselves. The men, even the hard ones, looked sickened. In the West, you could shoot a man over a card game, but striking a bound woman in open court was a cowardice that could not be forgiven. "Hey!" the blacksmith roared. Stepping forward, Sheriff Miller, who had spent his career bowing to the Kincaid name, looked at Cora bleeding on the floor. He looked at the crowd, which was now radiating a dangerous heat directed at Brett. He finally found his backbone. "That is enough," the sheriff shouted. He drew his gun. "Step away from her. Brett, you strike a prisoner in my custody again, and I will horsewhip you myself." Brett looked around, panting, his eyes crazy. He realized he had gone too far. "She stole it," he babbled. "It is mine." Then a voice spoke up from the back of the room. It was a rough, pained voice. He ordered the fire. "Sheriff." The crowd parted. One of Brett's hired men, the one with his arm in a sling, the one Cora had shot, stepped forward. He looked pale and angry. "What did you say?" the sheriff asked. "I said he ordered the fire," the man said, glaring at Brett. "We tracked them to the cabin. She did not ambush us. We surrounded them. Brett told us to burn them out. He said he didn't care if they roasted, as long as he got the paper." He spat on the floor. "I didn't sign on to burn folks alive, Brett, and I didn't sign on to get shot for a man who hits women." The confession hung in the air like smoke. It was the end. Brett Kincaid was exposed. Brett looked at the faces around him. He saw disgust. He saw hatred. He saw the end of his family's reign. He looked at Cora, who was getting to her feet, helped by Elias. She looked damaged, bleeding, but unbroken. She looked at him with pity. The pity broke him. "No!" Brett screamed. "It is mine!" He moved with the desperation of a cornered animal. He grabbed the pistol from the holster of the deputy standing next to him. It happened so fast the deputy didn't even react. Brett raised the gun. He aimed it straight at Cora's heart. "I will see you in hell first." Elias did not think. He did not calculate. He moved. He threw himself across the space, placing his body between the gun and the woman. A shot rang out. The sound was deafening. Smoke bloomed in the stagnant air. For a heartbeat. Time stopped. Elias stood rigid. Cora screamed his name, but Elias did not fall. Across the room, Brett Kincaid staggered back. His eyes went wide, filled with a sudden, terrible surprise. He looked down at his chest. A dark red stain was spreading across his white shirt. Right over his heart. He dropped the gun. It clattered to the floor. He tried to speak, but only a wet gurgle came out. He crumpled, his knees hitting the floorboards first, then his face. He lay still. Smoke curled from the barrel of the sheriff's gun. Miller stood there, his arm extended, his face pale but set in grim determination. He had finally done his duty. "Elias!" Cora grabbed Elias's coat, checking him frantically. "Are you hit? Did he hit you?" Elias looked down at himself. He patted his chest. No, he breathed. He missed. Or, the sheriff was faster. Cora let out a sob that was half a laugh. She pressed her forehead against his chest, her bound hands clutching his lapels. She shook uncontrollably, the terror washing out of her in waves. Elias wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, shielding her from the sight of the dead man on the floor. "It is over," he whispered into her hair. "It is done." The sheriff holstered his gun. He walked over to Brett's body and checked for a pulse. He stood up and shook his head. "Self-defense," the sheriff announced to the room. He drew on a prisoner. Everyone saw it. The crowd murmured. It was a subdued sound. Justice had been done, but it was a bloody, ugly justice. Unbind her. The sheriff ordered the deputy. The deputy cut the ropes on Cora's wrists. She rubbed the red marks, wincing. Sheriff Miller looked at Cora. "I will have to hold the papers for the circuit judge. Mrs. Kincaid, there will be an inquiry, but I think you are free to go for now." Cora looked at the sheriff. "Thank you." She turned to the crowd. She did not lower her eyes. Some people still looked wary. Old prejudices died hard. But then, an older woman, the milliner's wife, stepped forward. She pulled a clean handkerchief from her sleeve. "Here, child," the woman said gently. "For your lip." Cora took the cloth. "Thank you." A young miner nodded respectfully to Elias. "Good shooting on the mountain. Ward." Small glimmers of acceptance began to pierce the haze. They walked out of the saloon, leaving the body and the whispers behind them. They stepped out onto the boardwalk, into the clean, cold air of the afternoon. In the days that followed, the circuit judge arrived. He was a stern man who had seen everything the West had to offer. He reviewed the deed. He reviewed the witnessed betting slip. He listened to the testimony of the barkeep and the hired gun. His ruling was swift. The deed was valid. The high meadow belonged to Cora Jameson. The marriage was dissolved by death, and the Kincaid family had no claim on her property. Cora stood on the steps of the courthouse, the deed in her hand. She was a landowner. She was rich, by the standards of the territory. She walked to where Elias was waiting by the horses. He had packed his mule. He looked ready to ride out. "Where are you going?" Cora asked. Elias adjusted the cinch. "Back to the high country. The thaw is done." "Alone?" Cora asked. Elias looked at her. He looked at the town that was now trying to be kind to her because she had land. "You have a future here. Cora, you have property. You can sell that water for a fortune. You can build a house in town. You can be respectable. I am just a trapper with a past. I will only bring you trouble." Cora walked up to him. She took his face in her hands. His beard was rough against her palms. "Look at me, Elias Ward." He looked at her. "Do you think I want respectable?" she asked fiercely. "Do you think I want a house in this town, with these people who watched me bleed and did nothing?" She shook her head. "I want the valley. I want the wind. And I want the man who stood in front of a bullet for me." Elias closed his eyes. "I am old. Cora, I am scarred." "We are both scarred," she said. "That is how the light gets in." She kissed him. It was not a careful kiss. It was a claim. "I am going home. Elias, are you coming with me?" Elias looked at her. He saw the steel and the softness. He saw his salvation. "Yes," he said, "I am coming." They rode out an hour later. They did not look back at Red Creek. They returned to the valley beyond the Bitter Ridge. The ruins of the burned cabin were a black scar on the meadow, but the land around it was bursting with new green life. They did not rebuild on the ashes. They chose a new spot, higher up, near the source of the spring, where the view stretched for 100 miles. They worked side by side. They felled the timber. They notched the logs. They built a home that was twice the size of the old one, with a wide porch that faced the sunrise. Months passed. The summer turned the meadow into a riot of wildflowers. The air grew sweet with sage and pine. On a crisp evening in early autumn, beneath a sky so thick with stars it looked like spilled milk, they sat side by side on the steps of their finished home. The air was thin and cold, biting at their cheeks, but their bodies were warm from the work and from each other. Cora leaned into Elias, resting her head on his shoulder. His arm came around her, heavy and secure. "We should build a guest room," Cora said softly. Elias chuckled. "For who? The wolves?" "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe for strays, orphans, people who have nowhere else to go. There is enough room here, enough peace." Elias tightened his arm around her. "I like that." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the creek and the wind. "Do you miss it?" Elias asked. "The town." Cora laughed softly. "Not for a second." She turned her face up to his. "I was worthless down there," she whispered. Elias kissed her forehead. "You were never worthless. Cora, the world just didn't know how to count." Desire flared between them, slow and steady like the embers in the hearth. It was no longer tangled in shame or fear. It was just them. Two survivors who had found the only thing that mattered. "Let's go inside," Elias said, his voice husky. They stood up. Elias opened the door. Warm. Golden light spilled out onto the porch. They walked inside together and closed the door against the bitter wind. The dawn came slowly over the ridge, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of rose and violet. It spilled into the valley, lighting the windows of the new cabin in gold. Elias and Cora stood at the window, watching the sun rise. His arms were wrapped around her waist. Her hands rested on his. They watched the light reclaim the dark, just as they had reclaimed each other. The worthless wife was a landowner, a survivor, and a woman fiercely loved. And the mountain man who had won her at a poker table knew, with a certainty that went down to his bones, that he was the one who had truly been saved. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the snow and the fire, and I am grateful you rode the trail with me. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below and tell me which part of the world you call home. If you enjoyed the story of Elias and Cora, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more tales of grit, love, and survival on the frontier. And please share your thoughts in English in the comments. Did Brett get what he deserved? Would you have chosen the valley or the town? I look forward to reading your words. Until the next ride, keep your powder dry.